Good afternoon. We, representing officers and enlisted men of the U.S. Colored Troops, are here today to present to you the heroic contributions of African Americans during the great conflict known as the Rebellion of 1861, or the American Civil War. We hope to share with you the efforts of these men to abolish slavery and recognize the inherent entitlement of those persons of African ancestry in the equality of rights of American citizenship in law, suffrage, property rights, and privileges as promised by the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. Actions to abolish enslavement during the Civil War began upon the instigation of hostilities by those wishing to separate from the Union rather than accept the results of the presidential election of 1860, when they decided upon armed rebellion. Those in rebellion sought to establish a government with its foundation built upon slavery and the false assumption of white supremacy. The executive powers and laws of war provided the legal basis for the prosecution of the conflict towards an outcome abolishing slavery and the goal of establishing civil rights for all American citizens, regardless of the color of their skin. So through the legislative and lawmaking powers of Congress, such as the Confiscation Acts and Militia Acts of 1862, they provided the President, Abraham Lincoln, the authority to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. That proclamation, published in the press and distributed nationally, and issued as General Orders Number 1, was further emboldened with the creation of the United States Colored Troops, which we represent, and additions to the Articles of War. I will read to you just a few. Number 23. Private citizens are no longer murdered, enslaved, or carried off to distant parts.
Oh my word, you'll have clothes on.
A victorious army, by martial power, inherent in the same, may suspend, change, or abolish the existing laws of an invaded country. Slavery exists according to municipal or local law only. The Digest of Roman law enacts the early dictum that all men are equal. Fugitives escaping from a country in which they were slaves have for centuries past been held free and acknowledged free. Therefore, in war between the United States and a belligerent which admits of slavery, if a person held in bondage come as a fugitive under the protection of the military forces of the United States, such person is immediately entitled to the rights and privileges of a freed man. We wish to provide you the story of the U.S. Colored Troops and how they helped win this war and create this country and to what it is today. They are the foundation. We're going to take turns speaking to you today, and we're going to try to focus on the events of 1864 while also giving you an overview of the African American in military service.
Great. All right then, howdy folks, thanks for coming out today. My name is Julian. I am one of the privates here with the 97th USCT. Just as Jeff said here in the beginning, we're going to take it back just a little bit because we need to give a brief amount of context to how the USCT began. I'd like to roll the clock back to around the late 1840s, moving into the 1850s, and specifically with the Compromise of 1850. That compromise acting as a band-aid for the American Civil War, there were many facets to try and, I guess, make things better between the North and the South when it came to issues discussing slavery. Unfortunately, part of that meant that it gave more powers over to the South with the ability to capture or re-enslave African Americans in the North. So if you had escaped and you had gone up to the North, there's now the possibility after the Compromise of 1850 that someone could come after you in, let's say, a city like Philadelphia, and then bring you back into slavery, back into a state like Georgia. It is because of that that African American communities began to create localized militias. Now, these black militias were not everywhere, but they were in a number of communities in the North. And the ones that we do know of did the best that they could to try and protect their communities from slave catchers and those that would attempt to bring those individuals back into enslavement. I'd like to tell you briefly about one of these regiments, that is the Massasoit Guards. They specifically existed in Boston, and their role was very pivotal to the anti-slavery actions that went on in the city proper. It should also be said that the men who formed these core units of these African American militias, like the Massasoit Guards, would become the nucleus of a number of various USCT regiments when those regiments would be raised. Keep in mind, these African American militias were supplied generally either through benefactors, the local community, or in any other way in which they could receive arms and ammunition. Now, in cases like the Massasoit Guards, they would do parades in and around Boston, and they would also perform certain actions like freeing enslaved people. By the time that late 1862 rolls around and we get a variant of the Militia Act, that is what will allow the creation of USCT regiments. And just like I had said, when those regiments would finally be allowed to be raised in 1863, the very famous 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which I'm sure many of you know because of the film Glory, some of those men who were part of the Massasoit Guards would bring their expertise and their knowledge to the 54th Regiment. I give that as an example, but there are others across America and in other black communities where you would see these regiments who would then form the core of what would become the USCT regiments. With that being said, those regiments would be raised in '63 and then would go on to fight throughout the rest of the war. Now, I won't get too ahead of myself there. I'll pass it on.
So we should mention that in the American Civil War, close to 200,000 African Americans served as U.S. colored troops. They represented a very large percentage of the American fighting force by late '64 and 1865. The state that recruited the most U.S. colored troops was Louisiana, with more than 20,000. And a lot of folks say, "What? I thought Louisiana was a southern state." Well, yes, it is, but it also had a phenomenal amount of, a very high percentage of African Americans living in Louisiana. So when the United States occupies in April 1862 New Orleans, recruitment of U.S. colored troops in Louisiana begins, and more regiments are formed by those men. So yes, 24,000 come from Louisiana. Would you like to speak a moment about cavalry?
Yes. The U.S. Cavalry, and specifically the 3rd Regiment, was assigned to protect the engineers whilst they were building the plank roads, the caissons, and the boats, and the pontoon boats. So we followed them all the way from New Orleans all the way to Vicksburg and protected them against Quantrell's raiders, also rebel raiders, and we did counterintelligence ourselves to provide reconnaissance for the engineers. And a lot of us became Buffalo soldiers because Colonel Grierson was a colonel in the Union Army. And so when he went west, a lot of the former U.S. colored cavalry followed him to the west to protect the settlers from the Trans-Mississippi migration after the war.
So there is a definite difference between soldiers fighting who are white guys who live on a farm versus African American soldiers who were living in Louisiana as formerly enslaved. The big difference is a white farmer from Pennsylvania, when the war's over, he goes back to his family life as a white farmer in Pennsylvania. He still has all the rights and privileges and vote and own property that he had before. But for an African American male fighting in this war, it's a completely different case. They're fighting for their family, they're fighting for their rights, and they're fighting against enslavement. I'm pretty sure you've heard of an early battle in 1864 called Fort Pillow. It happened north of Memphis, and the troops were slaughtered there. And as a result of the massacre of U.S. colored troops, the U.S. government stopped exchanging soldiers. Now, the African American soldier also knew that if he was captured, he would be returned to slavery or killed outright for trying to incite a slave rebellion. White officers also put their lives at risk because they were considered to be trying to incite and lead a slave rebellion, which was punishable by death.
And kind of honing in on one of the what Lieutenant Captain said was pretty much in one engagement in particular on July 30th, 1864, which became known as the Battle of the Crater. So, under the command of General Ambrose Burnside, 4,300 U.S. colored troops were involved in the said engagement of the Battle of the Crater. For 3 weeks, men of the 48th Pennsylvania dug a tunnel underneath a Confederate fortification called Elliott's Salient, in which, leading up to the mining of this underground, well, basically mine, commanders of the 9th Corps, the corps that was assigned to take the said position, had doubts of sending in black soldiers because they felt like if this attack failed and the black troops were slaughtered, this would cause a political madhouse. Pretty much, it would give the impression that Union soldiers did not care one bit about black soldiers, and this would cause massive political issues. So they were decided to be held in the rear, in reserves, and the leading white units, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Division of the 9th Corps, to attack. So, leading up to the attack, the mine blew up. It destroyed most of the Confederate fortification and several of the Confederates defending it. But what happened was, when the Union attacked to seize the crater, instead of going around to try and take the position, they instead went into the crater. And several of the Confederate soldiers some that were still alive from the blast and some from the reserves, shot them down at point blank range. One Confederate soldier went as far by saying it was a turkey shoot. That kind of gave you an idea of just how chaotic it was. So when the black units were called up to support the white units that were going into the crater, they were also caught up in this hailstorm of bullets. And it was during this, when the battle started to die down, like what the lieutenant said, many black soldiers were captured, but they were killed afterwards or returned to enslavement. And this, once again, just honed in on a constant theme that occurred throughout the Civil War. And it's important to also note, I forgot to add this, was that during the Battle of the Crater, men of the black soldiers actually had a rally cry, which said, "Remember Fort Pillow," which pretty much meant if you're not trying to find the right words, but pretty much it was their battle cry. And pretty much during the engagement, one such soldier, Sergeant Decatur Dorsey of the 39th United States Colored Troops, received the Medal of Honor during the battle for, as it says in his Medal of Honor citation, rushing forward in advance of his regiment and placing his colors on the Confederate trenches, which is pretty much under a hail of gunfire, he seized his regimental flag and saved it. It was also in that same battle that 3 white officers who were also commanding USCT soldiers were also awarded. It was during this battle that the 4th Division of the 9th Corps, that was all black, had captured approximately 300 prisoners as a result of that battle and 1 Confederate battle flag. And it's also important to note that during the Civil War, it was approximately 21 African American soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor. Thank you.
So we're going to open it up to questions in just a minute. But before I get there, there's usually a couple of questions that are always asked. And one of them is, what's this white guy doing standing up here? So I need to address that. So when the decision was made to bring African American soldiers into the Army, the late 1862 was a great experiment kind of to see how this would work and to deal with the politics of the era, which was overwhelming bigotry. More than 95% of all people of African ancestry lived in the southern states. So there were a significant amount of people of European ancestry in the north who'd never seen anyone with darker skin than their own. Just what they saw as caricatures in newspapers and such. So when the decision was made to do so, it was clear that they could not just add African American men into regular white regiments because of the bigotry. It was also clear from early experimentations that there were officers and men of white regiments that absolutely refused to salute black officers or take orders from officers. They would even have regiments that said, no, we are not going back into battle with that colored regiment next to us. We're not going to do it. So they separated them out. Prior to the Civil War, there were multiple slave rebellions, the most famous of which was Nat Turner's Rebellion. After Nat Turner's Rebellion, the southern states and counties and cities passed laws known as the Black Code, or the Slave Codes, which would develop into the Black Codes, which he's going to speak about later. But these Black Codes made it illegal for multiple things to happen. For African Americans to have guns, for African Americans to preach the word of the Lord, for African Americans to gather in groups, for African Americans to do this, that, and the other thing. One of them was to learn how to read and write. So you had a massive illiterate population. So when building an army, you need you need a literate army because there's a lot of paperwork. Because you need corporals and you need sergeants and you need officers, and they need to read and write. Those infantry manuals and artillery manuals and such, they're complex. So it was discovered quickly that that was an issue. So to fix those multiple issues, they had white officers. And each regiment in places like New Orleans, Port Hudson, etc., they set up schools so that the literate first sergeants and sergeants, any literate African American man was made a first sergeant or sergeant because they needed to read and write. And then they set up schools and then taught the enlisted, the privates and corporals how to read and write. Because they knew at this time to be an American citizen and to be successful, you needed to be able to read and write, have legal equality, and to own property.
Great. All right. Last thing before we get to questions that I will bring up, and I'll just keep it very brief. This is a very heavy and very important topic, but it should be said that the men who served in the USCT, all of them served with distinction, and in particular, at the end of the war, right, the end of 1865 comes around, we start moving into a period known as Reconstruction. And it is there that you would see the USCT regiments that would occupy the South. This would cause, obviously, much consternation from the Southerners who did not want to take any type of order, not only from the federal government, but from African Americans wearing Union Army uniforms. Should be said that the men who served in these regiments would end up entering normal life, especially after the war would end. And a number of those men would also become the first black congressmen and senators as well. A lot of folks don't know that those were USCT veterans that would make up those particular individuals. Reconstruction was a very difficult time for African Americans and also a very difficult time for America, and it is very sad to say that through the political machinations that were going on in Washington, a lot of the bounties, which were things like $100, $300, right, given to some of these men, or even something as simple as 30 acres and a mule, would not be recognized by the federal government at the end of the war. All of that was pushed to the side, specifically so that way there could be a reconciliation between white Northerners and white Southerners. But that being said, the men who served in the USCT would also begin to form early coalition groups that would eventually become what would become the civil rights movement later on. So we have a burgeoning civil rights movement that begins towards the end of the war. Should be said though, abolitionists and the anti-slavery movement goes on even before then, so this discussion of whether slavery was a moral and just and good thing, it was never seen as such, because even in American society as early as 1776, you had anti-slavery groups and organizations. But that's a conversation for another day. I think, Jeff, we're going to open it up a little bit.
Well, we do. We're pretty sure that out there is the question about pay, because I know most of you have probably seen the movie Glory, right?
Yep.
And there's that saying, tear it up,
Tear it up,
tear it up,
Yep.
because they don't get paid the same. So First Sergeant's going to discuss pay for a moment.
Originally, the government decided that we were only worth $10 a month. And so, as the captain said in Glory, they highlighted that by saying, rip them up, because eventually the government realized that the U.S. colored troops were equal or better in some cases than the white troops. So we started getting $13 a month.
It's also important to note, I think it was one thing especially, was that it was also reduced, the $10 payment that was issued was actually reduced to $7 a month because of a $3 clothing allowance. So it meant less pay. They were taking away money of the black man's pay. So it was already, if it was just bad enough, you're just being given $10, well, we're going to take this $3 out of it for your clothing allowance.
So that was one of those things too, that as the war progressed, Congress decided that pay should be equalized. Furthermore, they decided that pay should be equalized and back pay for the difference should also be issued. So there were, and how soldiers were paid back then, it wasn't by the week or by the month. Instead, although they were allotted that pay, when they're out on campaign, they're not getting paid typically. So they will get several months' pay all at once. So suddenly they have nothing, then suddenly they have a pocket full of money. And sutlers, they'd love to sell them an expensive hat.
And all kinds of accoutrements. Now,
Go ahead.
one thing that the captain forgot to mention is that there was a class tier in Louisiana where the Creoles were actually above the black citizens. And so that is why, being a Creole in Louisiana, I had an opportunity to learn reading, writing, and ciphering. And so I was very valuable to the military because the commanders and the personnel under his command chose the first sergeants and the sergeants because of their knowledge and their ability to read and write. And so we subsequently taught other soldiers how to read and write, and the chaplains held classes in the Army teaching soldiers how to read and write, and also wrote letters for them for their back home if they were illiterate.
Thank you for making that distinction. And to add just one more tidbit to that, when these regiments are formed early on, they discovered that on a lot of these plantations, because they're owned by Frenchmen, that all the slaves speak French and not English. So first sergeants and sergeants who were bilingual in English and French and Spanish were in very high demand because of that obstacle as well. Because they had to teach them those commands in English.
And also, a lot of them spoke Creole. And so we were trilingual.
Yeah.
There it is.
Because French is close to Creole, but not really.
Great. All right, now I think it'd be best if we open it up to questions. I really do. I think it would be good. So
You'll probably keep a better time than me.
yep.
So I'm curious, you were talking about how sergeants were, first sergeants were teaching others how to read and write. Did any of them just stay in the north or go up to the north or take their families? And was there a way to do that? Because there was so much bigotry and that was still going on.
Well,
Like,
this is a kind of a good segue to go into Buffalo Soldiers of the Midwest.
Well, what happened was Colonel Grierson was in the Civil War, and he commanded black troops. And so when the Trans-Mississippi migration happened, everybody's starting to migrate west after the Civil War, then a lot of the U.S. colored cavalry officers followed Grierson to the west and become Buffalo soldiers.
Did they take their families with them? Or did they
Yes, ma'am. That is actually what happened to Juneteenth. The black troops moved in. Texas had been withholding the information. And so when the black troops arrived, everybody's going, oh, you know, what's going on? And so that was a major event and started Juneteenth because it was in June that they arrived.
Any other questions?
Yep, right here.
That's a great question.
Yeah. So at the beginning of the war, there
Hold
were
up,
quite a
sorry,
few.
Jeff, real quick. We're just going to repeat the question so we can say it out loud. It was, did any black troops end up getting the rank of commissioned officer by the end of the war? Okay, go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, actually, I think you would be better off tackling this question.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. Shocking.
My,
Color me surprised. Yes, so okay. So I feel like the answer to this question is somewhat yes and no.
it is somewhat yes
The
and no.
Corps of Afrique
Yeah,
all had black officers.
officers, right, yeah, the Corps d'Afrique did, right. So,
I guess we'll mix it up.
Yeah.
So, because they faced racism in Louisiana when the Corps d'Afrique was originally put together, they more or less forced them out.
right.
But we have to make a distinction between whether you're 100% African, 50% African, so on and so forth, which is a whole other topic. So there are some men of color who actually remain as lieutenants and captains all the way to the end of the war. But as the political and social atmosphere is changing throughout the war, in a lot of, by the time the 25th Corps is created at the Siege of Petersburg, it's those men that are going to go to Texas and trigger the Juneteenth thing. There are several lieutenants and captains that are of African descent.
Right.
And there's even major, and a lot of surgeons were African American.
Yep.
And that number increased as the war moved on.
Right, and the same thing goes for chaplains as well. Some of them also had that like higher officer status. The reason why also we say yes and no, probably why Jeff pointed to me at this, is because of the black militia concept, right? When you are running a militia regiment, generally speaking, you would be in a higher officer position, right? I'm not entirely sure how that translates over into the federal army, but you know, you could say that colonels are usually the ones to raise regiments themselves, so generally speaking, you could be considered a colonel if you raised a militia regiment. But how that rank would transfer over properly into the U.S. Army, it's always a little shaky because they obviously didn't want to give that higher up command to a black person, right, who was running a regiment. So, yeah. All right. Any last? Oh, yes. Yes, ma'am.
Did I understand correctly that at some point the black troops were not supposed to be chaplains?
Okay, I'll repeat that. The question was there at any point in which black troops could not become chaplains, right? That was the point of the question.
And
Okay.
if not, why?
Okay, and if not, why? So that's it.
Well,
Yeah, Jeff,
my
question.
research is mostly focused on U.S. colored troops raised in Louisiana, in the Department of the Gulf. In that case, there was a very high demand for African American to be chaplains in the Army, and they were hard to come by. One of the reasons why is how African Americans did their church service and their routines and so forth looked a certain way that had come from plantations and such, blending different traditions, etc. And so when you take a white chaplain from an Anglican church, let's say, and move him down to the South, it's different. So that was a problem, and trying to get people to do that was difficult. The same thing, there was the same getting surgeons of African American descent was a tricky issue too. They really wanted them. It's finding those that qualify.
It was difficult. Yeah, it was absolutely difficult. But there were trained black surgeons even back then, especially in the North as well. A lot of them, got their schooling from up there. But it was just hard to do. So, all right. Yes.
Are you each representing a specific individual?
I think it depends on who you talk to. I myself, no.
Meaning.
I might be the only one that actually represents an individual. It's kind of how I got into this. One of my ancestors escaped from a plantation, and I was in South Carolina, Honey Hill Plantation, and made their way north up into an area called Hilton Head. And he was recruited there, and he did 3 years as in the Army, as a Army enlisted, as a private. And when they were done with that, he got out. He went on. He got a farm. He made a family. So I guess the point is, some of us get into this for different reasons. Some of us are in here because we just love the history.
So,
And some of us feel a strong tie to our ancestors and our past, or maybe both. So.
Yes, red term for my grandfather. And I have a great uncle that was stationed with the Buffalo Soldiers in Fort Huachuca, Arizona. And so I'm a direct descendant. And so I am very stickly about history.
the question was, for those who couldn't hear, do any of us represent any particular individual who had served in any one of these regiments? The answer is varied. Some of us no, some of us yes.
But some of us also had relatives who did fight in the Civil War and were USCT. It was my great uncle. He was I think a private in the 4th United States Heavy Artillery Regiment, and they were mostly based out in occupation in Arkansas. So I have family connection there.
Great. All right. Oh, last question.
You talked about the black pay, but I have no comparison for hospital pay for whites.
About $13 a month. $13 a month for white soldiers. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but by the end of the war,
No clothing allowance either.
by the end of the war, it is $16 a month
Yeah. Got bumped up.
for them. For them.
Yeah. Yeah.
But as an officer, a lieutenant made 105 and a captain 115. We had to buy our own uniforms and equipment. They were all made for us. You had to go to a tailor. You were responsible for buying your own hat and uniform. So that was one of the reasons for the extra pay. And your own food. Officers had to buy their own food.
No, it was 13 for white soldiers. 13 for white soldiers. But then it increased a little bit.
So we usually get a question out there regarding the draft and conscription. So when enlistments begin, they offer U.S. colored troops 0 in most cases if they sign up, and then they begin issuing bounties, and that's if you sign on the dotted line and register, enlist, we'll give you $100. And that $100 bounty was then paid out in 3 different segments at the end of each year of service. So it'd be $33, $33, $33. Some issued a $300 bounty by the end of the war. That's $100 each month. Those weren't always followed through and paid out. And then when the draft is introduced, there were also men who were drafted into the Army.
All right.
I think we covered it all.
That's what the New York riots were about.
Yeah.
With,
If you have any
with
further
the Irish.
questions, and if you do have any further questions or anything of interest, please come down to our camp over there.
All right. Thank
Thank
you
you
for coming
very
today.
much. Thank you.
All right, gentlemen.
Exactly. Well, exactly.
The fight didn't happen too often. And that was the third street, right? On both sides.
They weren't. Well, yeah, both sides were not interested in it when they first were involved.